All right, so tonight I'm going to talk about immigration and Mahwah history. And I found out as I was working on this that it is a gigantic topic. It basically covers all of Mahwah history. And so you're going to get an overview. I can't do as much detail as I might like for some time periods and things. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the way people immigrated into the United States. And so there's going to be a kind of macro and a micro look here, where I look at the big push factors and pull factors that brought people to the United States. And then I want to look specifically at what made them come to Mahwah. So let me just put this up. So one of the things I think that probably most of us have in common is that I'm the grandchild of immigrants. So 3/4 of my grandparents were born in Ireland, and the fourth one was a small child when she was born in America of parents who were from Ireland. So I'm also married to a first-generation immigrant. So immigration is a big part of American life. It's the way the country was populated with our citizens now, and I think that it's an important phase of our story. So one of the things that you'll know is that immigration kind of waxes and wanes over time. This chart shows the number of immigrants based on the years. And you can see that there's times like in the early period of the country where very few people came over, then there's big pushes up and down. Sometimes it's things like World War I that make people not come, World War II. Other times it's legal changes. So the way that people came into the country changed, and the rules that guarded the way the gates are in our country changed, and that really affected the type of people who came and when they came. So I want to start with the first people here. We are not the founders of New Jersey. The Lenape or Delaware were the first peoples who moved into this area. So we could consider them the first immigrants, or we could consider that they were here from the beginning. The Lenni Lenape had a rich history here for more than 10,000 years before Europeans came. And they basically lived in this area. A lot of the names that we know about, place names in New Jersey that a lot of people in different parts of the country think are extremely strange, including the name Mahwah, come from Lenape words. So I think that part of, you can start to see the imprint that people left on the area as they come through, and we'll see that as we keep going on. So right now, the Lenape Nation still lives in this part of the world, in the Ramapo Pass. And they have been, they've been here. They've changed over the time, but the culture is still there, and they're trying to bring that culture back into our public eye. So a lot of the words, like I was saying, Ramapo, Campgaw, Mahwah, these are all Lenape words. And I think it gives us a sense of the past when we think about where these words come from. We don't usually think about them very much. They're just, it's the name of the town, right? There are other kind of traces of the Lenape that are still around. And we have, at the museum, we've got pottery, we've got projectile points, and we've got other kinds of, just real physical traces. We don't have written traces, and we don't have immigrant, stories of the Lenape from that far back. Those are more in their culture and in the stories they tell. The further back you go, the harder it is to actually document specific people. But I'm going to go moving into the next period, which is the colonization and expansion period. And this is not a good story for the Lenape. But we want to look at what brought people here in the first place. And when you think about the earliest colonists, they came here to make money. There was a lot of land here that was not unoccupied as far as from their perspective. There were natural resources, and it was dangerous. So the people that came, they were kind of looking for adventure, looking for some kind of a chance that they did. And And then others came to get away from persecution. That's going to be a story that we hear over and over again, and what drives people from their homes to find a new home. And a lot of people came as, you know, an arm of their government. There were French trappers who came, and you know, Spanish settlers who came into the continent to try to you know, dominate it, basically. And they did. And what they did, it came at the expense of the Native American societies that were already here. And that, you know, we all know that, but I don't think it ends up in the stories as much as it should sometimes. Some of the traces that remain from these older immigrants are some of the old stone houses that are still in the area. The first immigrants that we know of who came in from Europe were Germans and Dutch. And it's kind of interesting to think about what this place was like. Can people mute if they're not me? Just because I'm hearing cats. So the people that came were in a situation that's not very much well, like we think about the way Mahwah is today. There weren't roads. There were some paths through the woods. There was no farmland. It was all, you know, had to be carved out. So most of the people that came in the early days were trading with the Lenape. They were starting to build, to, you know, make farms out of the wilderness. And I think the people that came were often, there was a lot of French people that came into this area, and then there were also German Palatines. And some of the families that we still know about to this day in the area, like the Wanamakers and the Carlos and the Masingers, are from those German Palatine refugees. So the Palatines came around 1710, and they settled in the area of town we call the island. And again, the idea, it's always interesting to me to think about what would drive people to travel across the ocean in 1710 and settle in an unknown place with, you know, where you have to basically start everything from scratch. And part of what drove them here was the difficulty of the life that they had in Europe. But the conditions here were very difficult. They had to figure out a way to shelter over the winter because there was no trade. There was very little give and take with the cities that were forming over in Manhattan. But what they did is they started these settlements. They founded churches. They worked with the other groups, like the Germans and the Dutch shared a church. And some of the family names that we know about here with, like, the Hennians, the Bogarts, and the Schuerts. I think that what's interesting is there are street names in Mahwah for many of these old families, and so as you're driving around, you start to see them, and you're like, you know, I know these names. So by 1740, we only have 43 families living in Mahwah, and that's double what was there in 1720, but it's still a very small amount of people. And some of the traces that we can still see in town from those early immigrants are things like the Ramapo Reformed Church, the old Hopper grist mill, which isn't there anymore, but the historic marker still shows where it was. And then the Moffat Cemetery has graves from some of the people back from that earliest kind of settlement. We also have archival records. We start to have those for the documents from the 18th century. For America anyway. And this piece here is the deed that Blandina Bayard, the contract she made with the native peoples to get some property from them. This is actually at the New York State Archives, and this is probably the oldest document that talks about the land that became Mahwah. And we also have some letters from this time period. You know, there are a lot of archives like the New York Historical Society that have lots of old colonial documents, but we actually have some ourselves at the museum. This letter is from 1820, and it's talking about going down from Mahwah to Washington, D.C., which is kind of cool. But we have a few documents, mostly in the Hopper collection, that tell a little bit of a story of the people that came here very early on. Okay, so the next large immigration wave, and this was like the first big push, was from 1820 to 1870. And this one was different from other immigrants. So the people that came in this sort of second wave of immigrants were mostly German and Irish, and they were driven out of where they were. And the thing that's interesting about this time period is that this is the first time where an immigrant was seen to be a negative thing. So the Irish immigrants were driven mostly by famine and deprivation. So the potato famine drove 2 million people to leave their homes out of a country that had about 6 million people in it. And the people who came were very poor. So they were not treated the same as some of the other immigrants who were more kind of entrepreneurial. The Germans came for religious and political freedom. There were wars and revolutions going on in Germany at the time, and if you weren't on the winning side, you didn't have much of a future. So they came from different economic classes. So the Germans were a little bit better off. But you start to see in this like ad they have here, this cartoon, how immigrants are starting to be portrayed in America. And they're starting to be portrayed as too different from the rest of us. So therefore they're, they drink too much, clearly, the one with the whiskey and the other with the beer. But they're also seen as possibly dangerous. And I think that part of the issue is that a lot of them settled in cities and they became part of a political machine, and that made people fear immigrants. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I'm going to be showing as we go through this. And I got most of the information about what actually went on in Mahwah from the census. What I did is I turned the census records from 1860 to 1940 into a spreadsheet, and then I was able to kind of look at them and pull people out and try to find good examples of how immigrants impact Mahwah. So if you know about Mahwah's history, it is part of a larger township called Franklin Township until 1849. And it was, I didn't use the 1840 census or the 1850 census because the area of Franklin Township was far bigger than Mahwah. And there was no real way to cut it down to the people who lived in this area. So I started with 1860, where Mahwah was part of what was called Hohokus Township at the time. So some of the census, this is the 1860, I believe. They have information about who the people were, their ages, whether they're married or single. Sometimes they'll have occupations, and most of the time they'll have the place of birth of the person. Different censuses grab different bits of information, but for a long time, I think they always ask place of birth. So that's the key for this talk. So what I started doing are things like what are these kind of word clouds. And what they do is they count. In the 1860 census, there were 2,300 people. And this shows you, graphically how many were, where they were born. So the largest contingent is New Jersey, and then New York is second. And then you start to see these other places. One of the things that I found interesting that isn't part of this talk is how slowly over time, New York and New Jersey aren't they're still the bulk of the people that come from the town, but they're not as dominant as they are in the early years because people just didn't travel. If you were from Connecticut, there are a few people who came over here. It's not that far, but it was that far back then because we don't have highways, we don't have easy ways to get around. So looking a little bit more close at the people who came, you can see that, here 83% were born in New Jersey. And then the second biggest chunk is from New York. But then you start to see a smaller percentages of people from different countries. So Ireland has 3.6%, Holland has 1.2%. And these are snapshots because the day that the census is taken, that's, they're talking to the people that day. So a person who just moved into town that day, who's born in Ireland, is going to show up as an Irish immigrant. The next year, the census is taken in 1870. If they're still in town, they're still going to be an Irish immigrant. So that person will be counted over and over until they pass and they have children who are then not Irish immigrants. But I think that, so you see these kind of quick looks at what's going on in that one year. So trying to find some of these immigrants was kind of fun. So we can look at that census and then look for the people who were born in Ireland and try to see if they were there in 1850, because that'll kind of show you that they're new in town. So I found this one woman, and Mary Healy. So she comes over sometime between 1850 and 1860, and she's already widowed and has a relative. We don't know if it's a brother-in-law, a son. It can't be a son, she'd be too young. And they have 5 other children in the house, and all of them are listed as being mill hands, even their 4-year-old child. So by 1870, she's passed away and the family's gone. So they come right through town. They live, we don't even know how long they lived in town, but they were here in 1860. And by 1870, they're not. And I couldn't find them anywhere nearby. So it's just one of those things, but she's buried in, I think it's the Mahwah Cemetery. So we have that trace of the people who came here. And then a lot of the Irish who came either worked farms or they worked factories. There was a factory, blanking on its name, but it was in the Darlington area, the Hopkins, can't remember. Anyway, so that factory, there were factories in Suffern, there were factories in Paterson, and people would use the trolleys to get there. So some of them, like the Flanagans, another one headed by widows with children who all worked in mills. So we don't know, the census just says that they worked in a mill. It doesn't say where. But by 1870, they were in Paterson. So it seems to, they probably moved closer to the mills where they were working. And we find them, dying at 38 while working as a mechanic. They're not easy lives, the lives that the immigrants had, and the lives of anyone who worked in factories at that time period. And then I found that some Dutch immigrants, and that the Dutch settled in this area pretty early, but they were still coming throughout this time period. So we're finding new immigrants coming in. So the Vermeulens were farmers, and we find them coming in, like I said, they're not in 1850, but they're here in 1860. And there are still Vermeulens in Mahwah to this day. So some that came in and settled and farmed, I think, tended to stay in town longer, but the ones who came in and were working in factories were more in and out kind of immigrants. I don't have photos of these people, but I had some nice photos from the Hopper family, who were also Dutch immigrants, so I put them in here. But these guys, Henry Lockhurst he was an immigrant from Holland, and so he comes here with his wife and 8 children, which I'm still, 8 children is way too many. But he's working as a laborer. His son is a farmer. Most of the immigrants who come in this time period are working on the farms in town, because there isn't much in the way of factories. So again, the Lockharts are kind of immigrants who pass on through, and we don't see them again in Mahwah. So then I went to look at the surnames, and if you take every person's name in the census for that year and add them all up, and you can create these kind of crazed last name clouds, and you can see the kinds of names that we're seeing, and a lot of them are Dutch, and we can see some of the names of the Ramapo Lenape families are in here. We can see the Daters and Pullis, and names that you're familiar with still. And the Ackerman house used to be around the corner from where I used to live. So you can see the kind of names that were popular or common, I should say, in 1860. And then if we move into 1870, there isn't a lot that changes as far as immigration. The idea is still that people are still coming from these different countries, and you're starting to see a little bit more broad things. We've got the Germans, which for some reason in 1870, they all put in Deutschland. We've got Holland, we've got different pieces of Germany that come in, Prussia. So they're starting to, be a little bit more varied than they were in the past, but they're not dramatically different in 1870. And again, we start to see, New Jersey's starting to be, New York's got a little bit bigger chunk. We've got some Germans, you've got your Dutch, you've got your Irish coming in. And these other ones are just tiny little slivers from different states or different countries. So some of the German immigrants that I found, one were the Hetzel family, and they came in 1860 and began working in farms. They stay in the area for quite a while. I'm not sure. I didn't look to see if people are still here now, but the ones who settled in farms seem to stay here a little bit longer. So I found the grandson of Paul Hetzel, I believe. So he ended up working as a gardener on the Chapman estate, which is the new it's that new residence house that they put up on 202. And then we have other Dutch immigrants who are coming, and they were again working the farms with their wives and the children. We have another one, Lambertus Rosenblum, who ends up working on the railroad with the children in the cotton mills. So he had 11 children when he came here, and then he had a few more, and he died in 1907. So he's buried over at the Valo Cemetery in Ridgewood. And then we look at 1870, and we're starting to see more of a variety of names. We're still seeing those same names are coming up over and over, but you start to see, that there are more names in the cloud. Some of these ones, like the Masingers and the Hennians, are some of those older names from town. And but you start, there are starting to be different names in here. I still like, you still see lots of Ackermans and Smiths and Hoppers. So once we get to 1880, the census has got about 3,000 people, 2,900 in town. One thing that's going to happen in the next year is that several towns are going to break away. So this is probably one of the biggest that Hoboken Township is at this time. It gets a little smaller as the different towns break off. So the things haven't changed a lot since 1870. They still have, most of the people are born in New Jersey, the second most from New York. And here we've got about 90% of our people are from the United States. And again, the numbers are starting to change a little. New York's getting slightly bigger percentage, but we're still looking at the big kind of 3 or 4 countries, which are, the traditional ones that were immigrating at this time period. So the Irish immigrants are a little bit, they're again, they become tricky to find because they don't stay in town very much. A lot of them go through, but I did find this guy, John Wilson, who was a stonecutter when he came here. And then by 1880, he'd become a farmer, and he had children, and eventually one of his, I think it's his grandchild, becomes the police chief in Allendale. So this kind of story where a family comes in doing kind of manual labor like stone cutting, then they end up farming, and then they get more like one became a mail carrier and then a police chief. So you see that they get integrated into society in a generation or two. And I think that's something that you're going to see repeated over and over in the stories. So by 1880, there's more names. You start, there's still, you still see the big names like we're seeing every time because those people are still in town. But you start to see lots of little names starting to appear as there's more variety in the names that we've got in town. So from this time period, I had a little trouble trying to find some real good traces of the immigrants who worked here. So a lot of them worked the farms, and the farms are mostly gone now. You can still see, some little remnants at the horse rescue and Seeger Farm. And some of them worked in factories, but that one Hopkins factory in Mahwah has been gone for a long time. And so you can see you can see things like the trolley tracks, the old trolley tracks and train lines where people used to use to get to town. But I don't see a lot, besides some graves here and there, that show this kind of part of Mahwah's history. But the second wave of immigration is the one that I think we have the most kind of visceral imagery in our heads about. And it's like pictures like this ship where it's just flooded with people, and they're just coming in waves and waves of different kinds of people. So what brought the immigrants in the second wave of immigration to the country, and why were there so many more of them? Part of it was because the economy in America was changing. Originally, it was an agricultural economy, and families that came to immigrate would come out, push out into the Midwest, settle on a piece of farm property and start their farms. But once the industrial age began, there were plenty more jobs in cities. So manufacturers wanted to get large people all together in one place so that they could, basically get them to work for as cheap as possible. And so that, you're looking at a situation where they're trying to attract immigrants, and travel was cheaper. The steamships made it easier. They had learned how to make money at this. They got across faster, and it didn't cost as much. Some of the immigrants who came, that meant they were able to basically have a little less money than the ones who came before. So they might come over, they might send a single individual over to get a foothold in the country, get a job, and then send for the rest of the family. That happened a lot with Italian and Eastern European immigrants. And the immigrants who were here already kept telling their friends and family to come on over, that there's plenty of room, there's work. So immigration really peaked in those years, like 1880 to 1920. And in 1907, that was the biggest year for immigrants coming into the country. So the immigrants that came in the second wave were different. They were from different parts of Europe, from further in Europe, and not so much from the edges, who had easy access to boats. So these immigrants had to make a trip over to Western Europe before they could then make the trip over to the United States. And a lot of the people that came in this time period were from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they were being driven out by a lot of political upheaval. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire were expanding, and they were basically getting rid of people who didn't fit their idea of what a Russian or Austro-Hungarian should be. So people, a lot of the Slovakians, the Poles, the Czechs, the Lithuanians, the Jews, they were all being pushed away from their homelands. So a lot of times in this group, the men would come over first, find jobs, and then send for their kids and their wives to join them. Another large group were the Italian immigrants who came from really bad conditions in southern Italy. And most were peasants. They were less educated than other immigrants had been, because they didn't have schools back there. And they came from land that was very difficult to work and to make a living on. So they came over and found, some of them would stay in farming, but a lot of them ended up being working in factories in these cities. Okay, so the 1890 census was burned, which destroys any hope that we have to figure exactly what was going on in Mahwah in 1890. It's very sad. But so Italian immigrants came in. We don't have as many coming into Mahwah as we have of Eastern Europeans, but the Italian immigrants who came in seemed to work mostly in the farms. So the Vitaliate, I'm guessing, family emigrated in 1890. We have the most lovely collection of photographs from this family working in orchards. They owned a farm at one point, like a fruit stand on Pullis Ave. And we've just got these great shots of them playing guitars, and it's just very cool. So in 1900, which is the next census we have since 1890 is burned, you can still see that, we're starting to see Italy, we're starting to see, actually we're starting to see lots more different states in the United States show up, which shows that people are starting to travel within the United States more. But there's still not a big push of people from these other countries that are showing up in the rest of the country. So we see, like, again, it's Germany, it's Ireland, it's England, it's a little bit of Italy showing up now, and it's just mostly native people coming, native born Americans. And again, the names, like every time I pull this up, there's more kinds of names. You start to see a few different ones, like Garibrandt wasn't there before. But it's a very similar kind of, names. So one of the things I think that changed the town the most was the construction of the American Brake Shoe Factory, which was founded in 1902. It was linked with the railroad, and it offered factory jobs in Mahwah, which is what brought most of the Eastern Europeans to the town. The Eastern Europeans were coming into the country already, but they weren't settling in Mahwah until there was somewhere for them to work. So this factory really started a transition in Mahwah from a mostly agricultural town to one that started to have different kinds of economies. It had factories, and then it ended up, building the railroad helped people to, start to be able to commute to different areas. So you started to see more residential areas in town. So the other big thing that happens between 1900 and 1910 is that Ramsey breaks away from Hohokus Township. And this changes our kind of demographics, not only because it takes people away and businesses and things, but it also seems to me to have changed the breakdown of people in town a little bit. So of the people that start to come in this time period, we have German immigrants still. And if you haven't heard of the Pels family, they came in 1900. They bought farmland, and they had they have 7 children. So they end up on the farm until, I'm not even sure when they ended up selling the farm, but they're one of the last actual farmers left in Mahwah. But by the 1930s or 1940s, the children were all in World War II, and all 3 of his daughters enlisted in the Marines auxiliary. So it's it's a quick transition from a family who comes in 1900, and then by within 2 generations, they're like fixtures in Mahwah. They're part of the the war effort against the Germans, and they are end up being one of the family farmers people recognize the most in town. And then we have Hungarian immigrants coming in. So the Gazdas from Hungary came. Stefan came when he was 20, and he had I don't know whether his wife, whether they married in Hungary or in the United States, but she immigrated in 1908. So he starts out working at the American Brake Shoe, and they have children, their children again. They have 2 sons who are in World War II. They become members of the town. And, it's like very quickly you go from being a guy who works in a factory and who just came in off the boat to a family that's, part of the basic American life here. And we also had Czechoslovakian immigrants. I know that the Warhols became a big political family in town, but John Warhol Sr. came from a place that was in Austria-Hungary, but now is in the Czech Republic. And he was working at a hotel, and then he opens a convenience store selling candy and things in West Mahwah, becomes a leader of the community. And then his son, John Warhol, becomes like a major Republican power broker in town. So these kind of stories are starting to come from these families. So by the 1910 census, we have a smaller town. We've only got 1,700 people in town, but you're starting to see, Russia and Austria and Hungary, and these are fairly large compared to some of the other places like, Germany, and Ireland is in here still too. And here you see this kind of more dramatic looking change where we only have half the people in town are now born in New Jersey, which is, it's been like 70–80% before that. And you see a bigger chunk of the pie being taken up by people from different countries. I think that my nomenclature is a little bit dodgy on some of these, because the census would say things like Russia, Poland, and Austria-Hungary, and Hungary-Poland. And it was a little tough to try to pick which exact place to put them from. But you can kind of say that all these ones from Austria, Russia, and Hungary were probably all those peoples that were being displaced by the war there. And here's the word cloud again, getting busier and busier. So I'm looking for some names here. So you start to see some other names. So again, like Pulaski is coming in, and Minko and Baska and Stakov. So we're starting to kind of broaden the people that are in the city, in the town. So the Polish immigrants, the Januszewskis came into 1915. So I'm not going to try to pronounce the city they're from, but it was in Poland, and now it's part of the Ukraine. And so he served in World War I, and he met Mary Kopek at a dance in Passaic. They settled in Mahwah in 1922 and raised 9 children. He opened a butcher shop in 1924, and he's part of the Immaculate Heart of Mary Church. Dominic Skarzinski was a Polish immigrant to town. We got a lucky the American Brake Shoe had a little magazine that they put out, and they put a whole profile, his family, in there, saying like, America's good enough for me. It's so much better than being in Russia. But yeah, his wife had just come over. He'd come over in 1913, and she came over in 1920 because there was a war going on at the time. And so their family was separated until he had the funds to bring her over. But within a generation, his daughter was called Mahwah's Rosie the Riveter, because she's working at an airplane factory in Patterson. So it's just, you keep seeing these stories of people that come over, and by the next generation, or possibly the third, they're part of the town and part of our whole culture. So in 1920, we're still seeing people from Russia, from Germany, Hungary, Austria, all these countries that are still powering the new immigration into the area. And again, we've got a large chunk of people from Poland now. Hungary is smaller, but Germany is larger. So it's still this wave of people are coming through. There's an even bigger word cloud. So now we've got names like Zaliski, and we've got the Pelzes are here now, and Cisco's and other kinds of Olasevskis starting to fill up the people in the names or mailboxes. So the traces that remain from this larger immigration are some of them are things you don't think about. All those rock walls on Route 202 were basically put together by the Italian and Hungarian immigrants who worked on the Havermeyer farms, clearing land and uprooting trees, and using the rocks that they were digging up to line the roads. So a lot of those rock walls come back from that time period. And then West Mahwah, which is like a section of town that kind of formed around the American Brake Shoe factory, is a lasting reminder of the kinds of people who came in there. A lot of the property was developed, and houses were built by the brake shoe factory for their workers. So a lot of them are on smaller plots of land, and there's churches, there's stores and things in that area that are based, remind us of the way that area of town developed with the Eastern European immigrants. And the brake shoe factory buildings themselves still exist. They're called the Mahwah Business Park now. But if you go up to them on these areas here, you can see the old designations for the buildings. And then we have the churches that were founded. One of the things that was different about this set of immigrants from earlier immigrants is that they were different religions. So the Polish they would come start their own churches. So the Immaculate Heart of Mary was a Polish Catholic church, and the Holy Spirit Byzantine was for Eastern Europeans who followed the Greek Orthodox religion. And then Irish German immigrants founded the Immaculate Conception Church. So the broadening of the different religions in town are part of the story of how our town became more varied and more diverse. And then there's the traditions that are still here today. The Janix Meat Market that was opened in 1924 is still here, and it's I guess it'll be having its 100th anniversary in a couple of years. So parts of, some of the things are very clearly still here in town that show what we've had and the kind of people that used to live here and still do in some cases. All right, so the next chunk of change for what happens with immigration in the big picture is the closing of the gates. So anti-immigrant sentiment rose as the numbers of people came into the country. The government started banning different groups of immigrants. First, it was Chinese, and then other Asian groups coming from the West Coast. And then in 1921, they started the effort to try to change the influx of Southern and Eastern Europeans. So they started by trying to limit immigration to 3% of the number of residents from that country in the 1910 census. So if you had, if you had 6 million Hungarians coming in, they're going to only let 3% of that come in. So that meant that countries that had already had established immigration, like Germany, England, Ireland, are going to end up with more people allowed in than countries like Italy and Poland and Hungary, who haven't had as many years to bring people over. So this not only cut down the number of immigrants, but it kind of twisted where people were coming from. And everyone knew it at the time. In 1924, they made it even more drastic. They changed it to 2%, and they also backed the date up to 1890. So rather than it being the percentages from 1910, it went back to 1890, where you had even fewer Southern and Eastern European peoples. So this, made a drastic change in the type of immigration and the numbers of people that were coming in. And they did not put any limits at this time on immigration from North or South America. So between 1920 and 1930, the census, the town booms in population. I think we had 1,700 in the 20s. Now we've got 3,500. And you see again, it's the same sort of broadness. We're starting to see more, again, a little bit more variety. You're seeing other states in the country drawing people. Some people are from the United States, not very specific. And here we start seeing we've got more Czechoslovakian, we've got Polish, we've got Germans and Hungarians, but still in New Jersey. And New York is starting to pick up more speed over what New Jersey's bringing in. So part of that might just be the ability for people to travel a little more easily. So the favored nations, we have some immigrants coming in who come from these countries that the gates haven't been shut down on. I found a few, but there aren't a lot of new immigrants coming in at this time. So we found Richard Dorner, who was a lumberyard man, and another dairyman from Wales. And then we had some agricultural workers. One of the guys that's kind of interesting is this Walter Ross, who comes over from Prussia. And he's not a farmer, he's not a dairyman or a carpenter, he's an investment banker. So he's one of the kind of people that ends up living in Cragmere on Airmont Ave and commuting into the city. By 1940, he's not in Mahwah anymore. But you can see that, that these people that are coming in, they're not laborers, most of them. They're a little bit more skilled labor. But we do still have some Eastern Europeans coming in after the gates have been closed. We found Alex Makarov, who worked at the, he's a foundry worker, so he worked at the American Brake Shoe. And we've had the Matiaks, who were weavers, who worked in a silk mill. So there's a few of them here and there, but most of the people that are coming in have already been in. In this case, I'm looking at the census, trying to find ones who said that they've immigrated between 1920 and 1930. Another group who were coming in at this point were Irish and Scandinavian people who were working for some of the wealthy families in town. So we have Irish maids coming in, working at the Havemeyer House, and then we have another maid or a nurse working for Prentice Ash on Olney Road, and then a Finnish couple of who were cooks who also worked for the Ash family, and then Prussian governesses and things like that. So these are the people again that are coming in that are it's a different kind of immigrant. These are coming into a different situation than some of the previous ones. So by 1930, we've got again a broad number of people. I don't know if anyone in the audience can find their family names in any of these clouds, but there's still, there's still the big names that have always been there are still there, because a lot of the people that stayed in Mahwah there for many, many generations, you can see their names over and over again in the census. Okay, so in the 30s, there was a lot of difficulty to immigrate, and there was also not necessarily a great drive to immigrate. The economic crisis wasn't just in the United States, it was everywhere. America wasn't a place where you could be sure that you could get over here and get a job. And the travel was more expensive for people that had no money. So more people actually left the United States and went back to Europe than came. We do see some impact. I don't see it in Mahwah very much, of German Jews beginning to emigrate to get out from under the Nazi power. Local Jewish groups, I found one newspaper clipping. This is, I forgot to put the date on it, but it's from the mid 30s, where they're trying to help people to get over. The one thing that's tricky in the 1940 census is they no longer put the year a person emigrated. So we have no way to tell anymore who the actual newcomers to town are. We can just tell that people have immigrated, or, are either immigrants or native. So in 1940, we don't have a big jump in population. And again, we have this broadening backgrounds for people, but not necessarily broadening for immigrants. So here are the numbers again. You can see where we still have a lot of Poles, Hungarians, but other places like Pennsylvania and Virginia are starting to show up in the list. And New Jersey and New York are still, eating up the lion's share of all of the places of birth. And the word cloud gets bigger. Not sure I needed to do this for every year, but you can see like some of the names: Trusevich and Ramanusk and Mihawks and Marazins. So there's a lot more. And I see, you're starting to see more variety in the last names of the people in town. All right, so looking at the trends over time, this is a little bit confusing, but if you trace a country like Poland, you can see here's 1940, 1930. You can see that they had very low immigration until around 1910, and then they really shot up high. Whereas a group like Ireland was higher in the 1880s and then dropped off. So there's waves, different waves for different groups of peoples, and there's different kinds of stories for each kind of ethnic group that came over. But I think that there's a basic, I think Mahwah's history basically follows the trend. We're a little bit later on the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe than the rest of the country was, I think, because there weren't those kind of job opportunities. So looking back, I should have scheduled this talk for after April 1st, because the 1950 census will be released on April 1st. And I could tell you more about who was in Mahwah in 1950. But I have a feeling that it isn't going to change a lot, because the gates were still closed. We might see some people coming in, refugees coming in after the war. That's actually what I'm going to be looking for when we get that census released. So in 1965, the laws changed again, abolishing the quotas. But in its place, they started a kind of preference system. So they want to, immigrants who are going to be able to add to American society. They wanted doctors and lawyers and all kinds of occupations that we don't have. And they started at this point to limit immigration from the Western Hemisphere. So they're trying to stop Mexican immigration mostly. So the result is an increase in immigrants from Asia, South and Central America, and Africa after 1965. And right now, I found stats that show the current immigrants in Mahwah are about 19%. And these are the regions that they come from. So you can see that again, Europe is not the most populous. It's the Asia, it's Southern, it's like the Indian subcontinent, it's Middle East. And I think that's the trend for America. And I think it's the trend that we're going to see in Mahwah as we get more census data. So this is one thing I wanted to try. If you have a phone, you can go on this website and you can click my name in 813, and then you can tell what country your immigrant ancestors are from, and then we can put the results up in a moment or two. Actually, while we do that, if anybody has questions now, I don't know if Ken, if you want them to put them in the chat.
They could either put it in the chat or they could unmute themselves and ask the question. We have a small group.
I have a couple more slides after this. I just want to give people time to
Sure.
do the activity. Let's just see if it has anything in here. No responses yet. I'll leave it up here for a minute. No responses. All right. I'm not going to make you do it.
Can't seem to get into poll.
Oh, you can't. Oh, I see some. You couldn't get into pollev.com. Bummer.
Yeah, it's asking for a username.
Oh, all right. Forget that. Some people were able to get in. All right, let me switch off that. Okay, so I always end most of my talks with a pitch. We have we can tell the stories that we have because somebody saved them. So whether you have, it's like an image, a person, a census record, an object, if those things get saved and shared, then we're able to tell these kind of more deeply rich, accurate histories of the people that lived in town. A lot of the basic history books focus on, political leaders. They focus on the wealthy. They focus on things like wars. They don't always talk about the people who actually live in a town, how those people's culture affect the town. So I think that it's really important to, share the stories. So if you've got family history stories from town, from people in Mahwah, we would love to get an opportunity to scan them, to take photographs, or to listen to stories. You can also record your immigrant ancestors or second generations, it doesn't matter, while you can, so that they get preserved. And I wanted to, I have a couple of photos here that Madeline Martis Gill sent me. These are the Januszewski family, and I think they're extremely cool photos. So I wanted to put them up. I didn't have enough room in this slideshow to put them all in. I'm going to flip to the next one, and then if we have any questions, we can go on to that. But that is what I have for you tonight. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, I think. All right. All right, does anybody have any questions or comments? Do you have anything to tell us about your family stories?
Hey, Cathy, it's Vicki Gallo. Just want to say thank you. This was a really, really excellent presentation. I enjoyed so much.
Oh,
Just,
thanks.
seeing so many names that I recognize just from, I work in the Mahwah schools. So I see so many of those names of kids, little kids who carry those names. And so to be part of that research that you did to explore all, many generations of their ancestors is really, really cool. I think the school kids, maybe they'd be interested in seeing this presentation on some
Oh,
level.
great. Well, we recorded it, so.
Yeah, I know. So thanks so much. And, we've only lived here for 5 years, less than 25. But again, I was able to put where my ancestors came from, but then I thought, well, my mother was from Clifton and my father was from Kingston, New York. So, in a way, I'd probably fall more into the New Jersey and New York category than I do in, Italy.
Yeah, I mean,
and-
it's interesting because the immigrants only, only one person gets to be the immigrant from your family, It's like
Yeah,
after
yeah.
that, we're all just Americans,
Yeah, exactly. So very cool. Well, thanks so much. I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed it.
Chat, I didn't see any other questions? I'm just gonna,
There's several comments about thanking you for a great
Okay.
presentation, but I don't see any questions yet.
okay, no worries. All right, so hopefully we'll see you at the museum, and if you have any any good immigrant family or any non-immigrant family history that you want to share with us at the museum, we would be delighted to have it. It really helps us to tell like more broad stories of our town, to know more of the stories of all the different people. So thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks
you,
again,
everyone.
Kath. Great job.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Hope to see you soon.
Yep.
Bye, babe.
Bye-bye.
Hey Kathy, it's Kathy Wedrell.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you? I didn't realize half those names from our class were like, I guess, really old, like Balog and Mihawk, and I
Right.
never knew all that.
I know, it's like fun when you start looking into the history. You're like, I know people with those names.
Right, yeah. Aw.
Like,
I always, what was that?
The Gazdas, I remember. I know Maureen.
Oh, yeah.
Gazda.
Yeah,
It's like,
that's
that was
what
her
Sister
dad.
Maureen, right? Because I saw that name too, and I never realized.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's
I always
great.
relate you to the pine tree. Do you remember that on Airmont? We
Yes.
Like when I guess I was at one of the Zoom meetings and I said, "Oh, hi," and you had to think who I was, and I didn't want to say that in front of everybody. Like, we went off the road and hit that pine tree in the
That's
snow.
right. With my mom's car while she was on vacation. Yeah.
Oh God, was it really? Oh God, but that was fun. I wish we could go back to high school.
Mhm. Yep. Good time.
Well, it was good seeing you.
Yeah, it's good seeing you too.
So thanks. Well, have a
Thank
good
you.
night. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Take care.
You too. Bye.
Okay, so I'll
Right.
end right here.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Ken.
Okay.
Have a good night, everybody.